Great, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. It's great. In that case, I think let's just get on with it and get straight into the theory. So session one is about modeling. It's about energy policy. This is all contextual stuff, and it will all, I hope, as the course of today and tomorrow, become relevant why we're talking about this. Now, I should introduce myself quickly before getting into that. See, that is where I come from in Cambridge. That's our office, our towering office block of 2 floors on a very sunny day in Cambridge. So our work's very much on modeling. We build macroeconomic modeling tools at global level, at national level, at subnational level. Those are the things that we look at. And we've been around for about, 30 to 40 years. And so we've got a lot of experience in model building. What we don't have experience on is sort of the policy situation in India and how things work, and that's where we really rely on people like you guys to come in. And we really want to stimulate interest in the model, so people that do know about policy in India, the people that are running scenarios, because there's a big gap, things that we can't do here. So I always start my general presentation about modeling with a quote. I think this is a really appropriate one to use. Sean Holley is an academic at Cambridge University, so somebody we work with quite often. This was actually taken from a training course that he ran, so I've shamelessly taken it and adopted it for my own use. But I think it's very good because it talks about the theory, it talks about reality, and it's getting across the message of how to bridge that gap. So some people want to do theoretical work. There are other people that very much focused on data and empirical work, and most models fall somewhere between those 2 places. Now, they're not all in the same place. There'll be a continuum, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But we're always trying to make do with the data that we have. There are limitations. And if we can adopt a modeling approach that fits within what Sean Holley said here, then I think we're doing quite well, and that's been our aim. So I'll probably refer back to this quote several times in the presentation. On this first one, really starting from first principles, why we use models. I hope that you guys have an idea about that already, which is why you're here. But we can run through that. Your definitions and terminology is really important, because we know economists like to confuse people with the various terms, so let's make that a bit clearer. Then the different types of models that are available. I'll link a bit to the underlying economic theory here as well, although the first session tomorrow is really going to go in a lot of depth on the economics. Quickly about some of the other modeling approaches out there. And then a few things to think about and key issues, both when designing scenarios for the work that you're doing, but also when interpreting results. Because all models are based on assumptions. The question is whether those assumptions are appropriate for the analysis that's being done. So we'll run through a few of those as well. Okay, so why do modeling? So this will relate, we'll come back to this quite strongly for the specific E3-India presentations. So economic impact, cost-benefit analysis, these are things that modeling feeds into. We're trying to put numbers on everything, because model is a quantitative tool. But it's not so much the exact numbers and going to 3 decimal places, all that. It's really, we want some idea about just the scale of the impacts, orders of magnitude here. And the model helps to give us that confidence in what we're doing. And looking at it from a policymaker's perspective, the likely impacts is the policy or investment sound. Policymakers want to know, I mean, they're most concerned about jobs, employment and unemployment. The questions that we often get are, we can implement this policy, people think it's a good idea, but if it destroys a lot of jobs, I'm not going to get elected again, so I don't want that. Modeling gives some idea about where we're going in that direction. And I'm sure you're all well aware, there's lots of models out there. We'll be talking about E3-India over these 2 days, which itself is derived from E3-ME, the Cambridge Econometrics Global Model. The other three at the top are roughly an order of complexity tools that are used in the US. So it's, I think one of the things that comes out of this slide is what do you define as a model? Because RIMS 2 at the top, this is just a collection of input-output tables, really nothing more complicated than that. So you can get multipliers out of it. It's useful for looking at sort of local investments. It doesn't really go any further than that. It's debatable whether you would call that a model at all, really. It's more just a set of data. Implan, the next one, also static, again very strongly based on multiplier analysis and input-output tables, is the way the sectors link together. But it adds a little bit more on. And then when you get to REMI, that's starting to have feedbacks and equations, behavioral parameters built into it. So that's coming down to something that's a lot more complex in nature. It has its advantages and disadvantages, of course. E3-ME, our own model, is probably the most complicated of all, which is why we have 2 days to try and shed some light on the way it works in the case of India. Now, cost-benefit analysis and impact analysis, what are the differences between them? So different countries evaluate policies in different ways. Cost-benefit analysis in the US and also the UK, my own country, is generally the way it's done. At European level, for the European Union, it's more impact analysis. So we often get asked, what's the difference between these two things? Yeah, cost-benefit analysis brings everything into money terms. You've got lots of different categories of impact. Some are economic, some are financial, some are social, some are environmental. You put a price on everything in dollars, euros, pounds, rupees, wherever you're operating. And you weigh up the options, and whichever option's got the biggest number in terms of value, you then give that to policymakers and say, you create this amount of value in money terms by doing this policy. That's great because it gives a very simple message, which is what policymakers want, but there are so many assumptions along the way in terms of how you convert real physical impacts to money terms, that there are, I think, quite recognized shortcomings of that now. The social cost of carbon being an obvious example. Do we know what it is? If we don't know what it is, it's very difficult to convert to money terms. So that's what the scales show, is just comparing two things in the same units, and you pick the bigger number. Impact analysis, a more subtle, nuanced message to policymakers. Everything that is calculated in its own units. So here we've got three different things. Annual jobs, that's just a number of jobs. Economic impact, which is like the GDP impact in money terms. And then tax revenue treated separately from that as well. Now you could add greenhouse gas emissions, health impacts from local pollution, unemployment, social impacts. There's a lot of different things. And these are all given in their own units. And there's no attempt to merge them all together. They're just laid out one by one. And you let the politicians, the policymakers, decide what's most important and what they want to go with. So question, where does modeling fall into all of this? Reasonably straightforward to answer that, I think. Modeling generates the numbers in both cases. The model can also convert to money terms for a cost-benefit analysis if you plug in the right assumptions. Or for an impact analysis, it produces the outputs that you put together. And of course, it may be that it's not just one model that's used here. You could combine tools to get a whole range across different areas. Now, I put on an extra slide on impact analysis because E3-India is really focused in this area. I'm not going to talk much about cost-benefit analysis today, tomorrow. So what comes out of the model is a whole range of indicators, which are split by state, by sector, and of course over time as well. These numbers are all feeding into what would be a policymaker's impact analysis. And you can choose which model variables to use depending on what you're looking at. So again, if I move it on, just getting into some examples. But the failures, first of all, this was a slide put together by a US colleague, and it talks about some of the work that's been done in the US, and two gaps that persistently are coming through in economic analysis. Now, the way it works in the US is not so much the modelers that are actually doing the analysis. The modelers put together the tools, and then they license them out to consultancies to use. Some of the consultancies are very good. They know what they're doing. They use the model sensibly. But others, they don't have the economic background, so they make mistakes in implementation. And these are the two most common ones. So failure to adequately capture the source of funding. The example I often use here is analysis of sports stadiums. Now, politicians and policymakers love building sports stadiums in the US because they're very popular with the people. It's a landmark and it's a legacy of the person that was in charge. How do they justify it? Well, they could use one of the earlier tools like RIMS2, for example, to say, well, if we build this stadium, it's going to create this many jobs for the local economy. It will generate this amount of value added and GDP within my town or city. Okay. Well, that's all well and good, but you're spending a lot of money on this. How would you spend the money otherwise? Where is that money coming from? And if you don't put that in, you're only seeing one side of the system, the benefits, without the costs involved. And this is done time and time again. The second point, recognize the limits, capacity constraints. And again, a basic multiplier analysis, there are no capacity constraints on. So coming back to the sports stadium example, it's going to create this many jobs, but are the people there to fill the jobs? If not, are they going to stop doing other jobs instead and other production will suffer? Again, often missing from the analysis, which means that the real world outcomes are nowhere near as good as what the analysis has suggested. I'm hoping that what we do today and tomorrow will take these things into account. The second one more generally falls into the model automatically. The first one is a question of scenario design. So we'll see how we go with the scenarios that we look at on that. But the idea is that we'll avoid these failures in the modeling. So yeah, some examples of how modeling is applied. This is really putting these up with the sort of thinking about later in the day, and when I hand over to you guys what you want to look at, to stimulate some ideas. So economic development, what are the economic impacts of shopping malls, sports stadiums, of course. Base closings, so that's army bases, and then shopping malls is up there again, because some of us love shopping. Transport infrastructure, so a lot of money spent on building transport connections in almost all countries of the world. How do you account for the costs and benefits of that? Well, okay, there's the activity that's created just by building the stuff, so the jobs for the people that are building roads, rail links, ports and airports. But then there's the more tricky bit about if you can get from A to B quicker, what does that mean? Which is something very difficult to capture within an economic model. So at times we just have to say, well, this is outside the scope of what we can do. Perhaps closer to E3-India, energy, natural resources, an example of a pipeline being built there. Again, an area where huge amounts of money are spent. Connections, electricity connections, gas connections, these are big investments that have big localized impacts as well. And it's not just connections, so building plants for electricity generation, and big investments, and the types of plants that are built, whether they're, say, coal or gas or renewables, again, very different amounts of investment involved, but also expenditure shifting around over time, so quite a complex thing to look at. So very much suitable for modeling. Now, I said the policymakers are most interested in jobs. Of course, they're also very much interested in their own budgets, so possibilities here. Example in the US about where some modeling has been applied on budgets and the fiscal position, but the same sorts of things in India, I know, really important. And certainly in my own country, the UK, we've heard about this continuously for the past decade. So it's something that's always near the top of the agenda. Health and environment, aspects of this. Climate change, of course, something that is a big issue now around the world, but also local air quality and how that feeds back into public health. This has been rapidly coming up the policy agenda recently. And the last two examples, again, particularly because these are drawing on the energy economy links in E3-India. Renewables, yes, there is a big renewables target for India. What does that mean? And on the other side, electric vehicles. The slide is referencing actually some of our own work in the UK and France, which now have targets for making all vehicles, not necessarily electric, but non-conventional by 2040. And we keep hearing about targets in India, which may or may not be true, but you guys know more about that than I do. Okay, so that was just a quick run through about where modeling might be usefully applied. I'm going to move on to sort of the next section of the presentation now, which is getting into types of models, and hopefully this will wind its way down to an introduction to E3-India and how it fits into this classification. Yeah, so there are, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, lots of models out there, lots of different types of models that do different things, that can be used to look at different policies, that give us different answers to different questions. I'll talk about three key distinctions in the models that are out there. And this is the first one, general and partial. So general modeling, what I mean here, and the terminology is not great, I agree. General modeling covers the whole economy. So all the sectors of the economy are covered. You add together those sectors, you get to GDP or something like it. There's no gaps there. The benefit of this is there are no gaps. It's impossible to shift problems around between different parts of the economy. You get numbers out for employment and unemployment that add up to the totals. The disadvantage is you're spreading it quite thinly, so you don't go into so much detail within each part of the economy. So the sectors are covered in a lot less detail. Where partial models come in, they look at just one sector or a small group of sectors in particular, but they have a lot of detail in that sector. And which one you want to use really depends on the question that you're asking. If the question is specific to one sector, then go with the partial model. But if you want the sort of contextual overview for the whole economy, then general models is going to be what you're looking at. Put up 4 examples of tools in Europe that are used. I won't talk about them now, but just for reference, you guys, I mean, I'll leave the slides here, so feel free to look them up. E3-ME is our own model, which falls into the Cambridge tradition, but computable general equilibrium models, CGE models, are also in there as well. Now, very much linked to that, top-down and bottom-up. Now, this is a terminology I really don't like, and I would avoid using it if possible, but just so you have an understanding when interacting with others about this. Yeah, top-down and bottom-up has two different meanings. In economic modeling, the difference is to do with how you go from the sectors to the total. So the top-down approach means you solve your model at the national level, so you get GDP, and then you work out the sectors after that. So effectively, you just share out the total to the different sectors, starting at the top and working downwards. The bottom-up approach, which is how E3-India is used, you get the results for all the sectors first, and then you add them together to get to the total. So starting at the bottom and working the way up. That's the economic terminology. Now, the energy terminology is completely different. The top-down approach is you apply an economic system. So like econometric equations, you explain what's going on without going into a huge amount of detail on it. But then the bottom-up approach is very technology-focused, more from an engineering approach than an economic approach. So you have your technologies, and you solve the model for those technologies, and the rest of the energy results come out from that. Now, E3-India, for the energy system, is more top-down in nature, with the exception of the electricity sector. But it means we have a slightly confusing situation. In economic terms, E3-India is bottom-up. In energy terms, it's top-down, except the energy sector. As I said, the terms are confusing, so I just try to avoid using them all together. But they do come up quite a lot in the discussions. Now, before we move on to the next slide, just linking this back to the previous one, general and partial modeling, bottom-up and top-down. The general models that cover the whole economy are usually, this is in energy terms, the top-down ones, because it's not possible to define technologies across every single sector of the economy. An impossible task to do that. So if you're covering the whole economy, you need to have a simplified representation, which is really the top-down one. If you look at just one sector in particular through a partial model, then you can start to look at technologies and use a bottom-up technology-defined approach. As I'm not going to be talking about partial models that much in the later presentations, just some examples of what they include. These are not the only ones by any means, but they are some of the most widely used ones. Again, there's some European examples up here if you want to look further. Partial models can be completely different in nature, even within these groups. So transport there's 2 examples of models. The first one, trans tools is a network model. So in Europe, it has all the different roads and rail linkages, ports and airports, and it works out how traffic moves between them. So a very spatial type model. Whereas TrainMove, the second one, is a model of vehicle fleet. So the types of cars that are there, the technologies they use, their fuel efficiencies, their fuel consumption and emissions that come out of that. They're both partial transport models, but they're looking at completely different things. They both could be connected to a macroeconomic model as well, and have been in the past, but two good examples of partial models. Now within the energy system, there's even more. There's a whole load here. Again, models are looking at different things. If you want to dig into this further, I suggest you look at the first one, the primes model, because this is what's used in Europe for almost every serious policy assessment at European level. It's sometimes criticized because it's used too much. So it's there. The manual you can find it quite easily if you look online. But again, all of these tools could be linked to a macroeconomic model in principle if you wanted to sort of go through that level of detail in the energy system to the economy. And then the last one, agriculture and land use, another area where there are very specialized tools being used that can look at different things. Image and Globium, which are two of the big European institutes are running, are splitting the world up into sort of a grid, looking at the land use in each area, so types of agriculture that are used, urbanization, things like that. Whereas Capri is much more looking at commodity markets and the prices of different crops coming out, and it's an equilibrium model that finds the prices at clear markets for these commodities. So again, tools that are looking at completely different things, but both partial agriculture / land use models that are all widely used. We wouldn't say one is better than the other in such as they're just looking at different questions. I didn't mention the industry sector. I love this slide, this picture. An example of a partial model of the steel sector, so it's 2011. I think I first saw this in 2010 from a working paper. And this was completely new to me, and it was quite, at the time, I thought quite mind-blowing for how to build a model of a particular sector. So it's very much bottom-up. You can see the technologies here. The blue box is blast oxygen furnace and electric arc furnace, and the model's basically working out the costs of each technology through all these inputs in the other boxes, and then choosing which technology to apply. Now, you can see this is from a Spanish institute, and the model was only ever built for Spain because to get the data for all of that was so difficult, they never got beyond Spain in doing it. They did have every steel plant in Spain defined though. So it's a really good example of the trade-offs here. We've got a very complicated modeling structure, but should give a good idea about how the steel sector operates, but the data requirements are so big that it's restricted to a very narrow geography in that. So something that goes quite beyond what the macroeconomic models could do at the moment, because they would just represent this by maybe one equation rather than having all this detail. But again, you see the trade-offs here. Coming back to the original quote, we just have to stick with what's possible. Okay, now shifting sideways a bit, the different types of models. Equilibrium and non-equilibrium. I suspect some of you want to hear what I have to say about this, as most of the general models out there are equilibrium models, CGE models. We're probably talking 95% at least, maybe 98, 99%. But E3-India is a non-equilibrium model, so we're very different here. And probably the question I get asked the most in my work at Cambridge Econometrics is, can you explain the difference between the two? What does it mean? What's the theoretical basis? And then from the policymakers, what does it mean for the conclusions? And how should I interpret the results from the two models? So I'm going to introduce some of the differences here, but I also want to emphasize the similarities between the approach, because the sort of university professors often focus on the differences, sometimes exaggerate the differences, I would say, but there are lots of similarities as well. But we all like having a good debate, so we focus on the differences. But I'll run through these 3 points shortly to show just how the differences are not quite as big as they're sometimes made out. Before getting to that, unfortunately time is a bit limited. I could talk about this probably for several hours, but we only have one slide on it today. Just the history of it. So 1960s and 1970s, it was macroeconometric modeling, really. Okay, we didn't have much computing power then, to put it mildly. See all the laptops sat out, we certainly didn't have anything like that. So there was a lot of stuff being done on pen and paper, of course. OLS regressions being solved manually. Imagine doing that now. But gradually, as we did start to get computers that were the size of rooms, and as I was reading earlier this week, you could use these computers to heat your dinner on as well if you wanted to, because of the amount of power they were using. But gradually, as the computing power increased, models were becoming more complex. Additional equations were being added and solved simultaneously, and economists were working towards a model of the whole economy. I mean, there were certainly models of the whole economy around there, but building up the level of complexity around these models, and they were mainly being used for forecasting exercises to inform governments and central banks about the state of the economy, the business cycle, and short-term forecasting in particular. That all came crashing to a halt in the 1970s. There was the oil crisis around this time, when a lot of the key relationships in these models started to break down, and they were becoming questioned a lot more. Now, one thing that was going on at this time was the models were increasingly being applied for real-world policy stuff by people who did not fully understand them. And this is often the case with new ideas. We all want to use the tools, but because they were so new, the richness of the understanding hadn't been developed yet. So when the oil crisis came up and the model forecasts were shown to be completely wrong, of course, people asked, why was this wrong? And the answers were not always forthcoming to that. And of course that led to, in quotes there, a backlash. And then quoting from Sean Holley again, he came up with these 8 reasons about why this backlash happened, and really why the momentum started to go against the econometric approach at the time. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there are 3 key ones in my mind. Certainly the second one, the Lucas critique from Robert Lucas, who I'll come on to shortly. Because of the oil crisis and the failure of the forecast and things breaking down, so why did the models not work? Well, Lucas said, if we look forward, we're in a different policy situation than we were in the past. So your behavioural parameters may not be appropriate to use. And because the model forecasts weren't coming up very well, this gained a lot of traction, and the Lucas critique is still around today, and it's still very relevant. He proposed rational expectations instead, which at the time started to become the main way of doing things, and offered an alternative. Now the third point, the one below that, micro foundations, something that's been floating around ever since macroeconomics was invented, which according to people that have looked through papers on Google, which was around the 1930s, I think the term macroeconomics started being used. But how do you link the micro to the macro? Well, the macroeconometric models were not doing that. They were just saying, we're not going to worry about the micro, we leave that to the microeconomists, we're just focusing on the macro. Whereas Lucas and friends had a version that linked micro to macro. Now, they had to make a lot of assumptions along the way to do that, but it was quite attractive to have a modeling approach that you could link down to individual behavior. And in terms of selling it to policymakers, it's much easier because you can always relate it to what the person on the street is doing. Rather than the macroeconometric approach that just say, well, we do this, we think this happens because our parameter says so. A bit more abstract and more difficult to get across to non-economists. So yeah, microfoundation is still a big issue, and there's lots of questions about its suitability. I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. But I'll skip down to the last point, just the ideological opposition to government, quote, control, which is really saying economics was reflecting the political situation and the way things were going in the US, in the UK at the time. The free markets movement, the politicians that were promoting this wanted a sort of economics that fitted with it. And that really led to sort of neoclassical economics coming back to the fore. Now, why is that important? Because these policy people were also the ones that were controlling the research funding. So that led to quite a large divergence of funding in this direction towards neoclassical economics and the CGE approaches that flowed from it, and it really started to set the tone for the next decade. Now, okay, CGE approaches started to take over. In the 1980s, there was also real business cycle theory, and eventually we ended up with new Keynesian economics, DSGE modeling that's still used in central banks today. It's really, it started from the basic CGE approach and it's added bits onto it, but the fundamentals are still very much the same. Now, what I want to say is while all of this was going on, the Keynesian approach, the proper Keynesian approach, the post-Keynesian approach, it obviously was very much reduced in substance, but it didn't go away altogether. It retreated to a small number of universities, Cambridge, of course, being one of them. And the research continued, but much lower profile in nature. So the macroeconometric models continued to be developed. The econometrics itself, of course, was advanced in this time quite a lot. And the structure of the models was developed a bit. So although all of these things were happening and the new modeling tools were being developed, what eventually ended up to the path that E3-India has been derived from, it certainly wasn't standing still at the time. And I'll talk about that a bit more in the later sessions. Again, some examples, and really just for you that want to go and look it up further. I think all of these have come up on previous slides already, but I just wanted to show that these distinctions between general partial and equilibrium, non-equilibrium, it's very much a cross-cutting theme. You can have equilibrium, general and partial models, and you can have partial equilibrium, non-equilibrium models. By all means, it really comes down to the focus of the model designers, what they want to look at, and the underlying theories that they follow. Yeah, I'll leave these slides behind as well, so you don't need to take all the notes from this. Okay, now coming on to the differences between equilibrium and non-equilibrium. The first of the three, something that we often hear that Standard CGE model is supply-driven. A standard macroeconometric model is demand-driven. Therefore, they are very different tools. They have a very different focus. Yeah, that's true to some extent. There is certainly a difference in focus here. In a CGE model, the level of output is determined by the supply-side factors and the best usage of those factors. With an econometric model, the level of output is determined by aggregate demand in a Keynesian sense. I'll go through that in the first session tomorrow morning in a little more detail about how that comes around. But just for now, I want to say that's the broad principles, but it's not quite as clear-cut as that, because in some of the CGE models now, there are constraints that are being put in on demand, not always going to a market clearing equilibrium in all markets, like the labour market, for example. So demand does have a role to play in there as well. And similarly, in E3-India and other econometric models, there are supply constraints being put in there as well. For example, you can't increase employment indefinitely because there is a fixed number of people. You can't go beyond that. And the economists are looking at other ways of putting supply constraints in as well. So if people say to me, demand-driven, supply-driven models, I'd say, yeah, that's a good starting point, but it's not quite as simple as that. Now, long and short-term analysis, something you often put. A CGE model is used for long-term analysis because it takes time to get to equilibrium and it doesn't look at the paths to get there. Whereas the econometric approach is looking at first differences, dynamic year-to-year changes, so it's a short-term construct. Again, there is some truth to this. In the 1970s, 1980s, it probably was quite clear-cut, but things have developed since then. CGE at times has been converted to DSGE, which specifically has a short-term component looking at the transition pathway to get to your long-term outcome. And the econometrics, of course, has moved on as well. We're no longer looking at simple first difference equations going year to year. Co-integration techniques have been developed to give a long-term path as well. So E3-India certainly long-term analysis is possible there, so short, medium, we're running up to 2035 in the model, and I think that's fine, and it's generally accepted that long-term outcomes are fine. So this one, I think, is a little bit dated, the distinction. There are differences, of course, but they're not as big as they used to be. Now, this is my favorite one. I'll leave best till last, theoretical and empirical. These, let's say debates, but maybe arguments would be a better way of putting it. You put a neoclassical and a Keynesian professor in a room and you let them start talking to each other, and you hear the Keynesian professor going, well, your model is entirely theoretical in design, it's not based on real-world data, it really shouldn't be used for policy making because it's just an abstract academic tool that doesn't bear any resemblance to the real world, don't use it. Whereas the neoclassical economist will come back with saying, well, but your econometric model is just a data construct, it's a data mining exercise, it doesn't have any theoretical background, it's just picking up historical patterns that may not persist in the future. And because of all of that, it really shouldn't be used for policy analysis. Now, if there's a policy maker in the room as well, they're just looking at it and shaking their heads going, what is going on, guys? I just want an answer, give it to me. And yeah, of course, they're right to say that. So yeah, where are we on the line? Well, it comes back to the original quotation. We've got theory at one end, practice on the other end, and all the models fit somewhere on that line. The distinctions are nowhere near as clear-cut as what I made out quite facetiously there. CGE models, of course, they have real-world data in them, goes without saying. Many of them are using econometric estimates for their parameters now as well, so the behavioral part is also coming from the data. So there's a big empirical part in that as well. Whereas the econometric models, well, the equations that are put together, they're not designed by accident. They're designed to reflect economic theory. And the data is just giving the size of the magnitudes through the estimated coefficients. So there's a big chunk of theory in there as well. They just sit at different places along the continuum. So the response to those professors is, yes, you have your points, but let's try and be a bit more constructive about all of this. And to be fair, this is happening a lot more now. There are things that the two approaches can learn from each other. Now, yeah, what does this all mean in practice? Again, as I said, tomorrow morning I'll go into a lot more depth on that. But for now, just see it's important. So this chart here, okay, it's the report on the left-hand side that's available online. If you put the title in Google, it will come up quite quickly. But this is one of the charts from the results showing the same scenarios run under two different models. The red line, our own global macroeconometric model, and the blue lines, the CGE model, not run by us. This is showing in the year 2050 the employment impacts of Europe shifting to a low-carbon economy. Now, we didn't do the energy modeling for this. That was done from the primes model that I mentioned earlier. But the economic stuff is all coming from these two models. And we've got 5 different scenarios there, different ways of reaching a low-carbon endpoint in 2050, which is what the labels are showing. And you can see the 5 different scenarios. The differences are not that big between them. It doesn't really matter how you get to the low-carbon economy. The impacts are roughly the same. But what is not the same is the results from the two models, very clearly here. Now, the CGE model has actually had to break the labour market equilibrium to get a change at all. So it's not a pure CGE model in that sense. But even with that, there's big differences between the two modelling tools. And 10 years ago, when we did a similar exercise using two models side by side, it didn't go down very well with the policymakers because it was really a no-win situation, because you ran the two models. If they produced the same results, the policy people said, well, why did we use two models for this when they produce the same results? It's a waste of money. Because if they produce different results, they like that even less. So it was no, but it took time, but eventually we got the message through that you use the two different models to understand what's going on in the economy. And most recently, when we've done an exercise similar to this, with some of the same people in the European Commission, it was clear that progress was being made, because they were starting to ask questions about how do the two sets of results relate to finance, how do they relate to where we are in the business cycle, which are exactly the sorts of assumptions that are different between the two modelling approaches. So yeah, what we have here, these are all positive results, so saying that Europe decarbonising leads to an increase in jobs. In the CGE results, the blue lines, that's basically just because we're moving from an energy-intensive economy to a more labour-intensive economy. So the sectoral shift, going towards sectors that employ more people, you get more jobs. In the econometric modelling, we get the much higher results, because they're saying, well, we've got that same shift as well between the sectors, and of course that creates jobs. But also, by importing less fuel to Europe, there's money that would have been spent on imports that's now being spent domestically, which gives you a multiplier effect and creates more jobs as well. And that gives you the rest of the increase, which is roughly double. Now, one thing to add here, and this is an aside about scenario design, so think about it later. These results also include a reduction in the global oil price, which of course stimulates demand and jobs in the economy. Why is the obvious question. This is supposed to be a policy analysis. Well, the European policymakers said this is a scenario to 2050 where we reduce our carbon emissions. Europe is not going to reduce its carbon emissions unless other countries do as well. If other countries do as well, global oil prices will fall because less oil will be consumed. So you should also have an oil price in your scenario. We said, okay, that makes sense, but the results that we present are not going to be the impacts of the policies, they're going to be the impacts of the policies plus the oil price fall, which explains almost half of these results. The European Commission said, okay, fine. If it's clear, that's okay. So when we put these results in our report, very clearly these impacts are the result of policy plus the oil price change. Now, of course, as soon as the report was published and people started presenting it, all that got forgotten about, and now it's just being presented as the impacts of the policy. So quite misleading in a sense, because it gives a very positive view of these policies when it's not, the reality is not quite like that. So yeah, we need to be careful in our presentation. Now, shifting away from the equilibrium / non-equilibrium approach, just briefly touching on a few other areas of modeling. Integrated assessment models, so this is what the IPCC uses, so all the big assessment reports. Working Group 3 is very much based around the integrated assessment models. There are two types of integrated assessment model out there. And by the way, when I mentioned terminology at the beginning, this is the worst example of all for the terminology, integrated assessment modeling, because again, it means completely different things to different people. And the term itself, integrated, well, all models are integrated, that's what they do, they integrate different things together. All models are used for assessment, because that's what we use the models for assessing things. And obviously all models are models as well. So what does this term even mean? It's completely meaningless in nature. But it is now commonly used for looking at models that link together the energy system, the land use, the climate system, and sometimes the economy as well. Now the large-scale models, there's two here, IMAGE and GCAM, but also REMIND by Potsdam Institute in Germany, the AIM in Asia Pacific region, and MIT's IGSM model as well. With this category, there's not many of these big models because they are so big in nature that they're quite difficult to maintain and handle. These are doing the work for the IPCC, for the big scenarios that are presented in the database of results that the IPCC holds. And they're generally quite well respected. They're used for a lot of different stuff, and the people pay a lot of attention to the results. This is a diagram I first did, you can see now 7 years ago for European Commission about where the different models fit in. So we've got integrated assessment models here, but starting on the left, the energy systems models, so this is things like Markle and Times, very simple relationship or flow of information. You have some economic assumptions, the model works out what that means for the energy system, and the results for emissions follow from that. The E3 models, like E3-India, is not that different. There's two extra arrows, but economy to energy, but then a feedback from the energy to the economy as well, because we're looking at the impacts of different energy systems on GDP and jobs. Emissions, of course, follow, and you can get emissions directly from the economy as well, for example, through industrial processes. So that's not too complicated. The integrated assessment models, they're ignoring the line from climate back up to the top. they're quite similar to the E3 models, except they don't usually have a link from energy back to economy, because they take a much simpler representation of the economy, and that's really just to keep the scale of the things manageable. Again, the more you cover, the less detail you can go into. The link back from climate to economy, I'll talk about on the next slide, because that relates to a different type of integrated assessment model. And then finally, maybe the easiest one of all, the big, large-scale climate models. These things take days to run because they look at so much detail in the climate, but they just focus on that one link from emissions to climate. Because that's talking more about our own work. But I wanted to talk about the smaller scale integrated assessment models. So things like DICE, Fund and Page, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. These are also called integrated assessment models, but they're completely different from the ones 2 slides ago. And this is really a problem with the terminology again. So where the previous models were huge in scale and had thousands of equations in them, DICE, if I remember right, has 17 equations in it, that's all. What these tools are used for is they're optimization tools. They're looking at how to get an optimal carbon price in that balances the damage of climate change against the damages of putting a carbon price on the economy. They have been used for serious policy. The US social cost of carbon is determined by runs from DICE, for example. But they do have shortcomings just because things have been reduced so much that what you end up with is a very rough representation. And really, several years after they've been used quite intensively, 2 papers came out at roughly the same time that said pretty much what I've been saying for the 3 years previously, but these guys are much more famous than I am, so they got it published and made got a lot of work out of it. But 4 examples of criticism there. There's lots more in the papers. The Pindic one, the title of the paper is something like what do we get from integrated assessment models? And then the first 3 words of the abstract is not very much. That's the tone of the paper. Stern was a bit more nuanced because the Stern review, he himself used one of these tools, the Page model. So he held back in his criticism a bit, but he still gave him quite a hard time. So running quickly through these 4 things, what are they? Arbitrary nature of economic damage functions. What that means is that big arrow that I showed going from climate to economy, we don't know what that is. As economists, we don't yet understand what these costs are. And if we don't understand them, we can't put them in models. So all we end up with is very rough estimates that are, in some cases, they've been taken from studies on agriculture and just extrapolated to the rest of the economy. So big extension there. Sensitivity to discount rates, yes, because we're looking very far into the future. The choice of discount rate can mean that where you end up in 2100 doesn't really matter. It's all about short-term costs. Assumptions of exogenous growth, that's talking about baselines, and what it's saying is that damages to climate damages, they might affect the level of GDP, but they don't affect the growth rate of GDP. And when we're talking up to 2100 or beyond, a long way into the future, it's the growth rates that matter. Because if you knock 5% off GDP in 2100, but if the world economy is growing at 4% a year, every year up to then, it's a very small impact that you come out with at the end. And then the last one, my favorite, again leaving it to the end, extrapolations beyond the available data. What we've seen so far in terms of global warming is roughly 1 degree, possibly slightly more, but that's the range we're talking about. Whereas these models are showing they're commonly showing changes of 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees in temperature. What happens once we get beyond 1 degree? Well, maybe up to 1.5 or 2 we have some confidence in. Beyond that, we don't know. So applying a linear extrapolation to something that is almost certainly non-linear is quite a big assumption. And the best example of this, which I saw reported, I think, in The Economist a couple of years ago, one of these models showed a scenario where global temperatures increased by 20 degrees, so a massive extrapolation from where we got to. And the model said, at 20 degrees, that's going to be harmful. We're going to lose 50% of GDP, which is quite a big economic impact. But this got out to the biologists and the hard scientists who said, well, if global temperatures increase by 20 degrees, none of us will be here anymore because it won't be able to live on the planet. So I think that 50% should have been 100% and then some. But yeah, extrapolations well beyond the available data that we have in some cases. Okay, one slide on agent-based models because they're very popular at the moment. Coming back to this issue of linking micro and macro, this is the strength of agent-based models, and it's why they get so much attention. That picture, I think, is meant to be of insects. I just love the colors in it, so I always put it in slides. But emergent phenomenon, going from micro to macro, beyond just adding things together, looking at how, when you take the system as a whole, it is worth more than the sum of its parts. This is really what agent-based models do. They're generally partial in nature because they focus on one particular part of the economy. There's not really a whole economy representation that goes into much detail yet. Although this might come in the future. We're waiting on that. But lots of research going on in this area, and rightly so. But then I'll talk through these modeling issues, which is things to think about both when designing scenarios, but also when interpreting the results of scenarios. And then just to finish this first presentation, some ideas about new developments in modeling and where it's all. Number one, the Lucas critique. There he is, looking very critical, as I say. Yeah, this is a serious issue. As I mentioned on one of the previous slides, this led to a whole shift in regime of modeling approaches being used. And it's an issue that has not gone away. It's still as relevant today as it was in the 1970s. So Lucas critique basically saying, if you change the policy situation, you also change the behavior, in which case your estimated behavioral parameters from historical data through the econometrics may not be valid. That's sometimes been extended to a more generalized version that says behavior in the past may not be a very good guide to behavior in the future, just because you'll be in a different world. So people put that to me and they're expecting me to come back and say with some response, robust response. But yeah, I mean, I agree with it. We can't get away from it unless we can find a way of predicting the future, in which case we don't really need to do any modeling at all, if that's the case. This is something we have to live with. So in what I say, the Lucas critique is most relevant when we're looking at big changes. So some of these ambitious decarbonisation programs that we see minus 80% emissions, things like that, definitely ambitious. It could easily be behavioural change there, so important to take into account. And similarly, the further forward we go into the future, the more there is for the potential for behaviour to change. So the response I give is, yeah, we can't get away from this. There is uncertainty in all model results. The projections are not perfect by any means. The further we go away from the current situation, the bigger the range of uncertainty and the more relevant the Lucas critique. Okay, next issue, technology. When we're talking about climate policy and reducing emissions, it's mostly a question about technology development, technology deployment. Okay, you can get some way with behavioral change, but without advances in technology, or at least using the best available technologies, we're not going to get that far. So you always get the question, how do you treat technology in your model? Do you treat technology in your model? Again, I will talk about that from the context of E3-India tomorrow, but more generally across models, yes, it's generally accepted now that there should be a treatment of technology. This is quite recent. Even 10 years ago, it was still often the case that there was an exogenous trend in technology. It was considered as something that's outside the system. What happens in the economy, what happens in the policy environment doesn't affect technology. Okay, we've moved on a bit from that now, and it's generally accepted most models should have some kind of representation of technology in there. The obvious question after that is, well, how do you do it? The slide says there's two ways of doing it, which relates back to the previous slides about the distinctions between the different modeling approaches. If you're looking at just one sector in a lot of detail, you've got a lot more scope to consider the technologies there and all the characteristics of those technologies. A more top-down, as in energy terms, general approach. You need something that's a bit simpler and can be applied across the economy. But this last point, really important. We clearly can't predict what's going to happen. People that have tried to predict changes in technology in the long term have usually come out looking quite silly from that. And if we can't do it, then the model we built can't do it. Let's be clear about that. And we sometimes get asked in our work, well, what happens if there's a new technology like fusion power, for example, that solves all the energy problems? How does that feature in your scenarios? Well, if you want a scenario with fusion power in it, you design a scenario with fusion power in it. The model's not going to tell you this. We can't predict it. Okay, the next one, labour markets. This comes back to a point I made previously that jobs is the #1 issue for policymakers. Okay, well, the model produces results for jobs, but how does the labour market work? Now, this is a case where different types of models vary quite considerably. If you had the most basic CG model that assumed labour market clearing, you would always have full employment in the model. Sometimes that's defined as you have employment and voluntary unemployment as people looking for new jobs. Whereas a demand-driven model like E3-India will also have involuntary unemployment in it as well, so quite an important distinction to make. Having said that, a second point, there's a big gap here in pretty much all the models that are out there about the types of labour and the skills associated with it. It's a general assumption that any person can fill any job, though, which in the real world clearly isn't true, and we need to think about a bit aside from the model analysis that's done. And usually, I recommend, if we're looking at transition scenarios, which is quite commonly what we are doing, you see big shifts in employment from, say, energy extraction and intensive manufacturing to services. So, well, the model says there's a big reduction in employment over here and quite a large increase over here, but can you get the workers across that gap? That's not a question the model can answer, so it needs a separate analysis. So these issues about skills shortages, skills mismatches, I think quite a big gap in all the models than there are there. Okay, next one, non-linearities. Who remembers from their econometrics lessons being told that elasticities are only correct at the point of estimation, and as soon as you leave that point, then you're increasing the uncertainty around it. Exactly the same thing in the modeling. We don't get away from that. The econometric estimates are done that way. So, yeah, essentially, we're assuming lots of things are linear or log linear, when, of course, in reality, we know these are likely to be non-linear relationships. A few examples up there on the slides. Threshold effects or tipping points. Once got asked by a policy person, how big does the carbon tax need to be to make a difference? Yeah, that's not really a question the model can answer, because you double the carbon tax, you double the difference, because it's a linear relationship. They weren't too happy with that response. They wanted a magic silver bullet, and I gave them a modeling limitation in response. But that's the theory that we have at the moment. Asymmetries, this is often talked about in the context of technology. If energy prices get very high, then people adopt more energy and efficient ways of doing things. They buy more energy efficient products. If energy prices come back down again, they don't usually go back to the way they were previously, especially if they bought a new car or a new washing machine. They don't get rid of it and bring the old one back. This is tough in the econometrics, especially when we've got limited data and short time series to work out how to deal with this. And in general, it's just missing from the models. Yeah, all models provide approximations. I hope that's not a surprise, but relating it back to the Lucas critique, a couple of slides back, when we move to a different policy position and the behavior change, well, that's because we're getting further away from the base, and the linear approximation becomes more important at that point. As the more the non-linearity in reality diverges from the linearity in the model, the bigger the range of uncertainty comes exactly back to the point that I made previously. And the last slide on this I had was just uncertainty more generally. Again, it's something I get asked quite a lot when presenting results. Have you considered uncertainty? I think a lot of policy people ask this just because they've been told that they need to ask it when they see modeling exercises, but there are so many different types of uncertainty in the model. It's very, very difficult to give a precise answer to that question, because we have uncertainty in the data, uncertainty in the parameters, uncertainty in the baseline projections going forwards that we have, uncertainty in the scenario designs that we have. So yeah, there's a lot to deal with in this question. It's quite a vague term that's often thrown around. But in economic modelling, we're probably a bit behind where some of the other areas are, because typically we run the model, we get a single answer out, and that's what we go with. Sometimes we might do a bit of sensitivity analysis around that, but quite limited in scope, maybe 3 or 4 extra model runs, and usually put at the back of the report or in an appendix, something like that. The climate modelers run their models hundreds or thousands of times in one go and get a full range of results coming out. So they're very much ahead of the economists in this sense. And there's probably something the economists can learn from this, but I've been saying this for 5 or 10 years and it hasn't really changed. Maybe I shouldn't put too much faith in it. But when I say it's recognised as an issue in the community, some of the community. Okay, the last few slides in this presentation, really just talking about the way things are going in the future. Again, it's something I often get asked, what are the developments that are going on? So current trend number one, wider coverage. So this is a chart from a report from 7 years ago. Each box here is an area of the Sustainable Development Indicators used in Europe. And the lines between them show where there are model linkages at the moment. The dotted lines indicate linkages that we don't understand very well. So the models are trying to do them, but the inputs are lacking a bit. So we've got economy in the middle of it. The response I got from the European Commission was, well, you're an economist, you would say that. Yes, okay, but it is what I believe, that the economy is holding all these different bits together. Okay, then we've got very common linkages, so energy in the bottom left, climate, which means emissions in the middle of that, up the left-hand side. Material consumption, that's sort of minerals and biomass use on the right-hand side. That's much rarer in macroeconomic models. The input-output modelers do this quite a lot, but the CGE and macroeconometric models less so. And then land use at the top. This box for other sectors, that's thinking back to the industrial model that I showed earlier, just looking at the really in a lot of detail at one sector. And that comes on to the second bit, that where lots more models are being joined together and new modules are being added that cover different things, going wider. There's also a deeper analysis for sectors with more data becoming available now. That Spanish example for steel, you can plug some of the data in now because more information is becoming available. So yeah, lots of joining of models, and if you can do that to take advantage of the different strengths of the tools, then that's great. And aside from the coverage of the models, how it's being done is also quite different. Two parts of this. First of all, after 20 or 30 years of arguing with each other, the neoclassical and the Keynesian economists are having some more constructive discussions and actually learning from each other and bringing some of the better aspects of each approach into the models. This is something that has taken a long time to happen, but well, I think as a new generation has come through, there's been more willingness to engage. The second part of this is the way things are moving towards interdisciplinary research, so economists being forced to talk to people from other areas, which has brought in a lot of insights, like the agent-based modeling, for example, which is used in lots of other disciplines as well. But there's lots still to learn there, I think, from other disciplines that can be brought in to the models. And then, is it possible to just rip it all up and start again with something better? There are a lot of people that suggest that we should do that, just get rid of all the current models and do something new. Interdisciplinary work that could feed into that, and agent-based models will be surely will be progressing. Behavioral economics, so maybe more on the micro side, but linking that into macro. Lots of research being done there, and the popularity of Kahneman and Tversky, and looking at ways that all of that can be incorporated into models. Definitely a current trend. Yeah, and then the fourth one, new data sources. Heard about this last week. Big data, online generation of data. Lots of things that we just wouldn't have been able to do before are gradually becoming available. One possibility, say, economic sentiment, which we don't have in the national accounts data. We might have from survey data, but if you go to Google Trends or something and work, you can work out sort of how people are feeling in terms of economics and degree of positivity out there. This is something that's been completely missing from the data sets in the past. But having said that, none of this has yet found its way into macroeconomic models as far as I can see. It's still waiting for somebody to make a breakthrough and find out how to piece it together. Last point, computing power, of course, continues to increase, which gives scope for models to get bigger and bigger as long as people can still understand them. We've got cloud computing offering pretty much almost unlimited power if you can spread it across different servers and different processors, which means there just will be potential to do things that haven't been done before. And really it's waiting for ideas. I think the technology is there already, so we might see things developing at some point quite rapidly in that direction. And then the last point, the 3 dots, if you remember, I said nobody can predict future technology. So I wasn't going to contradict myself by just laying it out. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but we are economists, so we should be adapting to it and making the best use of the information and the technology that we have at our hands. And that is the last slide on this one. Good. So we're a little bit behind, but I don't think too badly. Before I move on to the next presentation, which focuses on energy, modelling energy demand, and E3-India in particular, are there any questions about the general modelling context and anything on those slides that we want to get into? Either clarification or discussion, I don't mind. How do policymakers validate the models? Yes, good question. This does come up periodically. And the policymakers are not doing the validation themselves, but they want to see that other people have done the validation. It varies from model to model. I have to say, economists have often got away without doing much validation. And I guess the trade-off between the empirical and the theoretical part sort of dictates the approach that's used. Trying to match the model against the historical data, showing a good fit, is probably the most widely accepted way of doing that. I'll show, I think it's only one slide for E3-India that I'll show later today or tomorrow on doing that. But there is quite a bit more in the manual that you can see. Aside from the economic models, in the other areas, it's quite similar. I think you try to run the model over history and see how well it matches the data, or use half the sample and extrapolate across the rest. But there's no generally single recognized way of doing it. I suppose just one thing to add to that, and this I get quite fed up about hearing of economists. They validate their model by running 7 models together and seeing if they produce the same results. So, well, that's okay as far as it goes. It shows them there aren't any coding errors in it. But if all the models are based on the same assumptions, fine, you get the same results. But if those assumptions turn out to be wrong, then having 7 models that do that doesn't give you any higher degree of confidence in the results. So, yeah, difficult. Any more?